On February 27, 2026, the United States authorized a joint military operation with Israel against Iran, and within hours the transition from planning to execution was underway. In the early hours of February 28, cyber and electronic disruption gave way to a coordinated wave of strikes targeting Iranian command infrastructure, missile systems, naval assets, intelligence hubs, and senior leadership. The opening attack did not stand alone. It immediately expanded into a sustained campaign across multiple domains, drawing in regional actors and rapidly affecting shipping routes, energy infrastructure, and the wider strategic balance in the Middle East. Yet this moment did not emerge from a clear diplomatic rupture. In the days just before the strike, the United States and Iran had still been engaged in indirect nuclear negotiations, with further talks expected. What unfolded, therefore, was not a clean shift from failed diplomacy to war, but a sudden overlap, where active negotiation and imminent conflict briefly coexisted before force overtook process. For governments watching these events from the outside, the central issue is not only what happened, but how to interpret what happened. Did the United States move from diplomacy to war in a way that preserved the boundary between peace and conflict? Or did it blur that boundary in a way that undermines trust in diplomatic engagement? Can the use of force be understood as defensive or necessary in terms that other states can publicly accept, or does it appear discretionary and therefore difficult to support? And as the conflict continues, does the conduct of operations suggest restraint and discipline, or does it signal a willingness to erode the minimal norms that make war containable? Today we will explore these questions by examining how states are likely to interpret the conflict through the lens of shared international agreements and expectations. We will consider first how the manner in which hostilities began shapes perceptions of procedural trust under the long-standing norms reflected in Hague Convention 3. We will then examine how the justification for the use of force is evaluated within the framework of the United Nations Charter, where legitimacy is not determined solely by law but by whether other states can align themselves with the rationale offered. Finally, we will look at how the conduct of the war itself is judged against the humanitarian principles embodied in the Geneva Conventions, where reputation is shaped less by formal argument and more by visible adherence to, or departure from, basic norms of restraint. Together, these perspectives provide a way to understand not just the conflict itself, but the reactions it is likely to generate across the international system. We will not attempt to render a definitive legal judgment. Instead, we will reconstruct how this conflict is likely to be read by the international community on the basis of publicly available facts, and how those readings are likely to shape alignment, opposition, and long-term strategic behavior. The central argument we will develop is that the consequences of this conflict will not be determined solely on the battlefield. They will also be determined by how convincingly the United States' actions are seen within the shared expectations that still govern, even imperfectly, the conduct of states in war. Public reporting gives a fairly stark picture of how this war began. The United States and Iran were still engaged in indirect nuclear diplomacy in Geneva in late February, with talks ending without a deal, but with signs of progress and further discussions expected. At almost the same moment, the United States had already massed forces nearby, and President Trump issued the final go order on February 27th for what became Operation Epic Fury. Subsequent accounts of the opening phase say the operation began on February 28th with cyber and space-based disruption, followed by a coordinated US-Israeli air assault on Iranian command infrastructure, naval forces, missile sites, intelligence hubs, and senior leadership. On the public record, as it would appear to outside states, the transition from negotiation to war looks abrupt. Talks were still recent, no public declaration of war has been identified, and no explicit ultimatum with a conditional declaration of war has surfaced in the reporting. While US rhetoric included pressure and deadlines, these do not appear to have taken the form of a formal ultimatum linking non-compliance to the immediate onset of hostilities. The Third Hague Convention addresses the requirement to give notice of hostile intent. That matters internationally because the convention is not mainly about battlefield fairness. It is about whether a state crosses the threshold into war in a way other states can recognize as orderly and candid. When governments look at these facts, many will not focus first on the technical wording of the convention. they will focus on the political meaning of the sequence. A state that warns before striking is telling the rest of the system that it still accepts a visible boundary between peace and war. A state that strikes while diplomacy is still visibly alive sends a different message, that negotiations may continue right up to the instant they are overtaken by force. Even governments otherwise sympathetic to Washington are likely to read that as a credibility problem, because it makes future US diplomatic assurances harder to separate from military positioning. The likely reaction, therefore, is not just legal criticism, but a broader decline in procedural trust. Allies become more cautious about relying on US diplomatic timelines, mediators become more skeptical about investing political capital in last-minute talks, and fence-sitting states become more willing to describe US conduct as destabilizing rather than merely forceful. The historical pattern points in the same direction. Pearl Harbor remains the classic example not simply because it was a surprise attack, but because it entered political memory as an attack that overtook diplomacy and thereby came to symbolize treachery at the peace-war boundary. Roosevelt cast it as a date which will live in infamy, and the effect was to unify opinion against Japan. That is the kind of reputational mechanism likely to be activated here, though obviously in a different political environment and without the same scale of immediate coalition discipline. The parallel is not that every undeclared opening strike produces identical consequences. It is that when a war begins in a way widely perceived as collapsing the boundary between negotiation and hostilities, the reputational damage often exceeds the purely military event, because states start reassessing whether diplomacy with the initiating state can be trusted as diplomacy, rather than as cover for timing advantage. The same public record also shapes how other states will judge the deeper question, not whether the United States warned, but whether it had a persuasive right to use force at all. The war began as a joint United States-Israeli operation, after Trump approved a strike linked to intelligence about an Iranian leadership meeting, and that the opening attack killed Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and immediately widened into a sustained campaign. Later reporting describes the stated United States objectives as destroying Iran's missile launch capability, degrading its defense industry and navy, and preventing Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons. At the same time, there was no Security Council authorization for the initial attack, and United Nations Charter rules reserve lawful unilateral force primarily to self-defense if an armed attack occurs, while Article 2, Paragraph 4, broadly prohibits the use of force against another state. While the United States may frame its actions in terms of anticipatory self-defense tied to Iran's missile and nuclear capabilities, to outside governments, the initial picture is of a war opened by choice and strategic opportunity, not one clearly triggered by an armed attack already underway against the United States. That is where international reaction is likely to be most consequential. The Charter does not function politically as a court opinion. It functions as a common language through which states decide whether they can align themselves with a war without paying reputational costs of their own. If Washington can persuade others that this was defensive and necessary, many governments can remain publicly supportive or at least discreetly accommodating. If it cannot, the same governments face pressure to distance themselves. On the current public facts, the likely international split is easy to anticipate. A smaller group of close partners may accept a broad strategic rationale tied to Iran's missiles, proxies, and nuclear program. But many other states, especially non-aligned and global South governments, are likely to view the opening as aggression wrapped in anticipatory language. That does not necessarily mean formal sanctions on the United States. Power politics and alliance structure matter too much for that. It does mean greater rhetorical isolation, more resistance in multilateral forums, reduced willingness to provide diplomatic cover, and stronger incentives for other states to hedge against US preferences in related crises. The reaction will turn not on abstract legal doctrine alone, but on whether Washington's justification is usable by other capitals as a public story they can defend. On the current public record, that looks difficult outside a narrow block of aligned states. The nearest historical pattern is the 2003 Iraq War. That invasion proceeded as a US-led coalition action, but the enduring political issue was not whether the United States had military capacity. It was whether the legal and factual justification persuaded enough of the international community to sustain broad legitimacy. It did not. The likely lesson for the present conflict is similar. Even a very powerful state can fight without widespread endorsement. But when the justification narrative fails to travel well internationally, the long-term costs often appear as coalition thinning, procedural obstruction in multilateral institutions, and a durable reputational association with discretionary rather than defensive war. That pattern is less dramatic than immediate collective punishment, but often more enduring. Once the war began, the public record shifted quickly from why force was used to how it was being used, and it's at this level that the conflict has started to acquire its most morally damaging imagery. One of the most consequential incidents of the opening day, February 28th, was the strike on the Shajareh Tayyebe Girls' School in Minab. US military investigators later came to believe it was likely that US forces were responsible, and they later confirmed news reports that what struck near the school appeared to be a US Tomahawk cruise missile. The military's own findings pointed to the likely use of outdated targeting data that failed to distinguish between the school and an adjoining Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps compound. The school had a long and visible public online presence, including years of photographs and activity records, which raised obvious questions about how strike locations were vetted. The incident ranks among the worst incidents of civilian deaths in decades of US military operations in the Middle East. The Geneva Conventions, particularly the Fourth Geneva Convention, established the core protections for civilians in armed conflict, requiring that they be treated humanely and shielded from violence, intimidation, and indiscriminate harm. These protections are further developed in Additional Protocol 1, which codifies the principles of distinction and proportionality, requiring that parties direct attacks only at military objectives and take constant care to avoid or minimize civilian casualties. Few would argue that the US intentionally targeted a school, but that is no longer the center of gravity of international reaction. The Minab strike changes the narrative because it puts before the world a different question: whether they exercised credible moral discipline once they began using force. A Tomahawk missile hitting a girls' primary school full of children is the kind of event that travels instantly and emotionally across borders. It compresses a large and complex campaign into a single moral image that other governments, publics, and humanitarian bodies can understand without any detailed briefing. That is why a UN body has opened an investigation into the strike. Even before final legal findings, this kind of event shapes the reputational field by making the war appear not merely forceful or controversial, but insufficiently bounded by humanitarian restraint. That narrative has been intensified by the public reporting around the administration's prior dismantling of civilian protection capacity inside the Pentagon. The Washington Post reported earlier that the Defense Department moved to shutter or gut efforts focused on reducing civilian harm, including the Civilian Protection Center of Excellence and broader civilian harm mitigation and response work, while firing or reassigning nearly 170 personnel who advised commanders on limiting non-combatant casualties. The Post also reported that Hegseth had shifted emphasis toward lethality and loosened approval layers for strikes. ProPublica separately reported that the Pentagon's civilian protection mission had been dissolved and tied that rollback directly to the broader change in institutional priorities under Hegseth. It is unclear whether those cuts directly caused the Minab strike. But, internationally, that distinction matters less than the appearance of a pattern. When a school full of girls is destroyed by what investigators believe was likely a US Tomahawk, and the same administration had already been reported to have dismantled much of the apparatus created to reduce civilian harm, many states will interpret the two facts together as evidence of a permissive attitude toward collateral risk, rather than as isolated, unrelated developments. This is where the reputational danger at this layer becomes especially serious. Other governments can sometimes live with a disputed war if they believe the belligerent is still fighting within recognizable moral guardrails. But they become much less comfortable when the visible pattern suggests that civilian protection is being institutionally deprioritized at the same time that highly publicized civilian catastrophes are occurring. The wider campaign has already expanded into thousands of strikes and has produced large civilian losses and humanitarian effects. In that context, MINAB is unlikely to be treated internationally as a regrettable anomaly until proven otherwise. It is more likely to become the emblematic incident through which the rest of the campaign is judged. Humanitarian criticism will intensify, neutral states will find it harder to cooperate without qualification, and even close partners will face pressure to call publicly for restraint, investigations, and tighter targeting practices in order to preserve their own credibility. The moral question, in other words, is no longer confined to whether the United States complied with the technical ban on targeting civilians. It is whether the war is being conducted in a way that reassures the international community that humanitarian limits still exist in practice, and MINAB has made that reassurance much harder to sustain. The historical pattern here is familiar. Controversies over initiation often set the first terms of debate, but controversies over civilian harm frequently become the more enduring measure of a war's legitimacy in public memory. That is especially true when a single incident crystallizes broader anxieties about command culture, targeting discipline, and the real value placed on civilian lives. Unless Washington can show not only that it is investigating MINAB seriously, but also that it retains meaningful institutional mechanisms for preventing similar incidents, international reaction is likely to move further away from arguments about legal categories and further toward a judgment of moral danger. Once that shift occurs, it is usually broader, more durable, and harder to reverse than the original dispute over why the war began. Taken together, these three layers create a cumulative international judgment that is more political than doctrinal, but still deeply shaped by the legal frameworks. On the public record, the conflict appears to many outside observers as a war that began without visible formal warning, in the shadow of still active diplomacy, and without a publicly evident charter basis that many states can easily endorse. While the opening surprise may have been technically lawful, that does not neutralize reputational risk because the campaign's scale, civilian toll, and regional consequences quickly became central to outside perceptions. The sustained campaign is having widening effects on shipping, regional infrastructure, and energy markets. Those are exactly the conditions under which states stop treating a conflict as a bilateral dispute and start viewing it as a test of whether one actor is still operating within broadly intelligible systemic limits. That is why the likely international reaction is not best described as simple approval or disapproval. It is more layered than that. States are likely to ask, first, whether the United States behaved in a way that preserved a trustworthy boundary between peace and war. Second, they will ask whether Washington has offered a justification they can safely repeat. Third, they will ask whether the conduct of the campaign suggests a disciplined actor or a norm-eroding one. A state that looks weak on all three dimensions is not judged only as an adversary in one war. It starts to be judged as a source of systemic risk, which changes how others hedge, align, negotiate, and constrain. The likely outcomes are therefore less about a single dramatic punishment and more about a broader pattern. More rhetorical isolation outside the closest alliance network. More reluctance to trust US diplomatic sequencing. More friction in multilateral institutions, more hedging by partners, and stronger efforts by other states to preserve distance from the war's rationale and consequences. The historical comparison across the 20th and 21st centuries points in the same direction. States can survive criticism at one layer. They can sometimes even absorb major backlash at two. What proves harder to manage is a reputation for collapsing procedure, stretching justification, and then fighting in a way that appears morally destabilizing. That pattern is not merely theoretical in this case, it is already visible in how the United States' closest partners are responding. In the weeks since the war began, Washington has pressed for broader Allied involvement, particularly in securing the Strait of Hormuz and supporting ongoing operations. Yet European responses have been marked less by alignment than by hesitation and refusal. European Union Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas publicly called on the United States and Israel to end the war, and emphasized that Europe had not been consulted before its initiation, while also signaling reluctance to commit forces to the conflict. At the operational level, allies have resisted direct participation. Reporting indicates that United States partners have been unwilling to join naval operations in the Gulf, exposing clear limits to coalition formation. National responses have been even more pointed. The United Kingdom has distanced itself militarily and restricted the use of its bases for offensive operations, while Prime Minister Keir Starmer has emphasized economic protection and de-escalation rather than support for the war itself. Spain has gone further, reportedly denying the use of its bases for strikes altogether, forcing the United States to shift assets elsewhere. Across Europe, leaders have consistently framed their positions in terms of restraint, legality, and diplomatic resolution, rather than endorsement of the United States' rationale or objectives. Taken together, these are not the signals of a coalition forming around a shared justification. They are the signals of a coalition pausing, hedging, and in some cases quietly disengaging. There is no dramatic rupture, no formal break in alliances or explicit condemnation from all quarters. But neither is there affirmation. Instead, there is distance, conditional language, and an increasing reluctance to assume operational risk. That is how reputational drift begins. Major powers are rarely expelled from the system. They are too embedded for that. The more typical consequence is quieter but more consequential. Other states begin adjusting around them, limiting political exposure, resisting automatic alignment, and preparing alternatives. If the current narrative continues to harden, of a war begun abruptly, justified ambiguously, and conducted under mounting humanitarian scrutiny, this conflict is likely to accelerate exactly that kind of recalibration. At home, wars are not sustained by strategy alone. They are sustained by stories about fairness, necessity, and restraint that the public can recognize and accept. When those stories align with events, support can be deep and durable. When they fracture, support can erode quickly, sometimes in ways that surprise the governments that initiated the conflict. American history offers clear patterns. When war is perceived as forced upon the country, public reaction can consolidate almost instantly. After Pearl Harbor, the absence of warning did not weaken domestic support, it intensified it. The attack was understood as treachery, and that perception collapsed political division and created overwhelming unity behind the war effort. The key was not simply that the United States was attacked, but that the attack fit a narrative of unfairness that was immediately legible to the public. The dynamic is very different when the United States is seen as choosing war. In those cases, the burden shifts from emotion to justification. The Iraq War illustrates this clearly. Initial support was sustained not by fear alone, but by a widely accepted narrative about weapons of mass destruction and threat prevention. When that narrative began to unravel, support did not decline gradually. It broke. The issue was not only casualties or cost. It was that the war no longer appeared to rest on a foundation that people believed. Once that coherence was lost, political divisions widened and support became difficult to sustain. Even when a war begins with support, it can be undone by how it is fought. The Vietnam War did not collapse domestically because of a single military defeat. It fractured under the weight of events like the My Lai massacre, which forced the public to confront a gap between how the war was being described and how it was being conducted. Similarly, the images and revelations from Abu Ghraib during the Iraq War did not merely damage the United States abroad. They triggered domestic outrage, investigations, and a crisis of confidence in leadership. In both cases, the issue was not strategy but moral alignment, whether the conduct of the war still reflected values the public could accept. These patterns suggest what may lie ahead. When a war begins without a clear sense of necessity, when its justification is contested, and when incidents of civilian harm become defining images, the pressures do not remain external. They propagate inward. Public support does not usually disappear all at once, but it becomes more conditional, more divided, and more fragile. Over time, that fragility constrains political options, narrows room for escalation, and makes sustaining the conflict more difficult. The lesson is not abstract, it is practical. The same rules that shape international reaction, how war begins, why it is fought, and how it is conducted, also shape whether the public remains willing to bear its costs. When those elements align, support can endure even in hardship. When they do not, history suggests that the limits of public tolerance become one of the most decisive forces in determining how long a war can last and how it ultimately ends.